Do you know the difference between loving and abandoning yourself? Let me tell you the story of a guard dog that changed everything for me, and I hope it does for you too. This dog had watched over a farm for years. Every night, every dawn, every moment of danger, there he was, loyal, constant, invisible. One day, without warning, without making a sound, he simply left, walked toward the horizon, and never returned. Only when he was gone did the owners realize what they had lost. But here's what I find most profound about this story. That dog is you. It's me. It's all of us who have occupied roles in relationships where we became functional, where our value was measured by our utility, not our essence. And the question I want to ask you today is simple but deeply uncomfortable. In how many relationships have you been the guard dog? In how many have you waited years for someone to truly see you while you cared, fixed, and made life easier for others? Look, after years of accompanying women in therapy, I've learned something. Mature love is not built from invisibility, it's not sustained by silent sacrifice, and it definitely doesn't flourish when one person becomes the emotional guardian of the other. Because here's something we're rarely told. Staying where you're not valued isn't loyalty, it's self-abandonment. I want that word, self-abandonment, to linger with you for a moment, because it's what we do when we choose to maintain relationships that nourish us less than we nourish them. Let me explain something that happens in our brains when we become functional in relationships. When we take on these roles of eternal caretakers, our nervous system gets used to living in a state of constant alertness. We're always attuned to the other person's needs, always available, always solving, and little by little, we lose connection with our own needs, our own desires. This isn't love, it's emotional survival disguised as devotion. And do you know where this tendency comes from? Often it originates in our childhood, where we learnt that to be loved, we had to be useful. That affection was conditional on our good behavior, on our ability to not cause problems, to emotionally care for our parents when they couldn't manage their own emotions. That's how we grew up believing that being loved means being needed. And that equation, my dear, is devastating for building healthy relationships. But let's go back to the dog, because the most powerful part of this metaphor isn't just that he left, it's how he left. He didn't make a scene, didn't threaten, didn't emotionally blackmail. He simply exercised what I call the healthy cut. He withdrew in silence. This concept of the healthy cut is fundamental to understanding mature relationships, because cutting ties isn't revenge, it's not punishment, it's a profound act of self-respect. It's saying I can no longer inhabit a place where I don't exist as a person, where I only exist as a function. But here's the hard part. Why is it so difficult for us to leave? Why do we stay in places where we're not seen? Let me tell you about something I call emotional colonization. It happens when we internalize the desires and needs of others so deeply that we lose touch with our own. Our emotional world becomes colonized by external expectations. And when we think about leaving, we feel terror. Terror of the void, terror of loneliness, terror of not knowing who we are outside of the role we played. Because, and this is crucial to understand, when you've spent years defining yourself by your ability to care for others, the idea of not being needed feels like ceasing to exist. But let me tell you something I've seen time and again in therapy, that moment of panic you feel when you consider walking away from a relationship that doesn't nourish you. That panic isn't a sign that you love too much, it's a sign that you've learned to love poorly. Mature love doesn't create dependency. Mature love creates freedom. It allows you to choose to stay because you want to, not because you need to. It allows you to leave when the relationship no longer sustains you. Now, what happened when the dog left? The farm's owners began to realize everything he did, everything that was no longer there. And here's something very powerful. Your absence can be the most honest mirror you leave for the other person, a mirror that shows them their own negligence, their own taking for granted, their own inability to see. But here's something very important. Don't leave so that the other person reacts. Don't make the cut a manipulation. Leave because you need to rescue yourself. Leave because you deserve to exist beyond your functionality. And when you leave, when you manage to make that healthy cut, you'll encounter something both beautiful and terrifying. Yourself, the woman you've been waiting to meet for years, with your own desires, your own needs, your own way of inhabiting the world when you're not defined by anyone else. Let me tell you about what I call the emotional valley. It's the space you have to cross when you separate from toxic relationships. It's uncomfortable, it's lonely, it's uncertain, but it's in that valley where you begin to rebuild your identity from the inside out, not from the outside in. And in that process, you'll discover something wonderful. You don't need anyone's validation to exist. Your value doesn't depend on your utility, and you deserve to be loved for who you are, not for what you give. But beware, because here comes one of the hardest tests. When you start to change, when you start setting boundaries, when you stop being functional, it's very likely that the people who are used to your functional role will try to pull you back. They'll make promises, show remorse, say all the things you waited years to hear, and here you need to ask yourself something very honest. Are they really changing, or do they just want you to go back to being their guard dog? Neuroscience tells us something very clear about profound change. It doesn't happen overnight. Relational patterns are built over years, and modifying them requires conscious, consistent, and genuine work. If someone says they've changed because they're losing you but shows no real process of self-awareness, they're likely just reacting to their fear of abandonment. Because, and this is tough but necessary to say, often the other person doesn't miss you, they miss your function. They miss having someone who cares, who fixes, who's emotionally available without limits. Mature love doesn't work like that. Mature love sees you, honors you, celebrates you in your entirety. It doesn't reduce you to a function, doesn't take you for granted, doesn't make you invisible. And here I want to talk about something fundamental for women of our generation. We've grown up with narratives about love that have done us a lot of harm. We were told that loving means sacrificing, that the virtuous woman is the one who gives without limits, that our value lies in our ability to care for others. But those narratives were built in times when women had no other options, when our economic and social survival depended on our ability to please. We no longer live in that reality. We no longer need to sacrifice our essence to ensure our survival, yet many of us still act as if we do. We keep giving from scarcity, from fear, from the need to be needed. Let me tell you something I see a lot in therapy. Women who arrive exhausted, depleted, not knowing what they want, what they like, or who they are when they're not caring for someone else. They've lived so long in service of others that they've lost touch with their internal compass, and the process of reconnecting with that compass is what I call the silent revolution. It's when you start asking yourself, what do I want? What do I need? What makes me happy, regardless of whether it pleases someone else? These are uncomfortable questions because we've been taught that asking them is selfish, but it's not. It's emotional responsibility. It's effective maturity. It's the foundation of any healthy relationship. Because here's something I want you to understand deeply. You cannot love healthily from emptiness. You cannot build solid relationships from scarcity. To love another without losing yourself, you first need to find yourself. And finding yourself means, among other things, learning to say no without guilt, setting clear boundaries, communicating your needs, and consciously choosing where to invest your emotional energy. It also means learning to be alone with yourself without feeling like it's a punishment. Because a woman who enjoys her own company, who knows herself, who respects herself, who cares for herself, that woman attracts very different kinds of relationships. She attracts people who love her for who she is, not for what they can get from her. Let me tell you about something that happens when you start this process of reconnecting with yourself. Emotions you've been avoiding for years will surface. Sadness for the time lost, anger for having made yourself invisible, fear of an uncertain future. And that's okay. All those emotions are valid and necessary. The problem isn't feeling these emotions. The problem is when we avoid them by returning to relational patterns that hurt us, when the fear of loneliness makes us accept crumbs of affection, when sadness leads us to idealize relationships that in reality drained us. But something beautiful happens when you manage to face these emotions without running from them. You start to develop what I call internal emotional authority. You no longer need someone else to tell you you're worthy. You no longer need external validation to know you deserve love. You no longer confuse intensity with depth or drama with passion. And from that place, from that internal emotional authority, you can choose relationships that truly nourish you. You can build connections based on mutual respect, reciprocity, and shared growth. But let me be very clear about something. This doesn't mean you'll never care for anyone again. It means you'll care from abundance, not scarcity, from choice, not compulsion, from love, not fear. The difference is vast. When you care from abundance, you do it because it feels natural, because you have something genuine to offer, because the act of caring itself fills you rather than empties you. And when the other person doesn't receive that care with gratitude and reciprocity, you can withdraw it without drama, without guilt, without feeling like you're losing your identity. Now, I want to talk about something I see a lot in women who are in the process of leaving toxic relationships, the temptation to explain, to justify, to convince the other person why you're leaving. And I'm going to tell you something that might sound harsh but is liberating. You don't need the other person's approval to leave. You don't need them to understand your reasons. You don't need them to agree with your decision. You don't need them to acknowledge the harm they caused. Your decision to prioritize yourself isn't subject to a referendum, because here's something that women raised to please struggle to understand. Your emotional well-being is non-negotiable. Your right to be treated with respect isn't up for debate. Your need to be seen and valued isn't optional. And when you start living from this clarity, something powerful happens. The people who are truly right for you start showing up in your life, not because you're perfect, but because you radiate authenticity, not because you're free of wounds, but because you're consciously healing them. Let me tell you about what I call the magnetism of the integrated woman. When a woman knows her worth, when she knows what she wants and what she's not willing to tolerate, when she can be alone without feeling incomplete, that woman attracts relationships of an entirely different quality. She attracts people who choose her consciously, not who need her compulsively. She attracts emotional partners, not projects to fix. She attracts mature love, not dependency, disguised as passion. But this requires patience, trust in the process, and resisting the temptation to return to familiar but toxic relationships when loneliness feels uncomfortable. And here, I want to talk about something very important about loneliness. The loneliness you feel when you leave a dysfunctional relationship is not the same loneliness you'll feel when you reconnect with yourself. The first is emptiness. The second is fullness in your own company. The first pushes you to seek any relationship to fill the void. The second allows you to consciously choose who you want to share your life with. Because, and I want you to engrave this deeply in your heart, being alone isn't an emergency to be resolved as quickly as possible. Being alone can be a state of grace, a space for reconnection, an opportunity to know yourself without the interference of others' needs. Many women come to therapy telling me they don't know who they are when they're not in a relationship. And I tell them, perfect, that's exactly the information you need. That's the greatest opportunity you have to build a solid, independent, authentic identity. Because when you know who you are in solitude, when you enjoy your own company, when you have a loving relationship with yourself, then you can choose to share your life with someone else from abundance, not need. And that's the difference between adolescent love and mature love. Adolescent love says, I need you to be complete. Mature love says, I am complete, and I choose to share my completeness with you. Let me tell you something I see in women who've done this work of reconnecting with themselves. They develop what I call a crumb detector. They no longer confuse minimal gestures with great love, no longer settle for occasional affection, no longer mistake inconsistency for passion. Because when you've experienced what it's like to have yourself as constant, loving, reliable company, you can no longer settle for relationships that offer less than that. And here's something beautiful. When you relate from this place of personal fullness, you not only attract better relationships, you also contribute to healing generational relational patterns. Because when you stop being someone else's guard dog, you give that person the opportunity to grow, to take responsibility for their emotional maturity, to learn to relate in a more mature way. They won't always take that opportunity, true, but at least you're no longer complicit in their emotional immaturity. I want to talk now about something that happens when you start systematically choosing yourself. You develop what I call emotional coherence. Your words, actions, and decisions begin to align with your deepest values. You no longer feel that internal fragmentation you used to feel when you said one thing but did another. And that coherence is magnetic. Authentic people recognize authenticity. Healthy relationships seek other healthy relationships. But I also want to prepare you for something. When you start living from this authenticity, some people will feel uncomfortable. People who were used to your functional version and don't know how to relate to your authentic version. And that's okay. It's part of the process. Not everyone will be able to accompany you in your growth. Not all relationships are meant to evolve, and that's not a tragedy. It's natural emotional selection. Because here's something I want you to understand. You're not responsible for managing other people's discomfort with your growth. You don't have to make yourself small so others can feel big. You don't have to go back to being functional to maintain relationships that only work when you're inauthentic. Your responsibility is to yourself, to your well-being, to your integrity, to your growth. And from that well-executed personal responsibility, you can offer genuine, reciprocal, nourishing relationships. Let me talk about something crucial in this process: learning to trust your intuition. Many women come to therapy telling me they don't know what they feel, that they constantly doubt their perceptions, that they've lost connection with their inner wisdom. This happens when you've spent so long prioritizing others' emotions over your own, when you've been so functional that you've unlearned how to listen to yourself. But your intuition is still there. It just needs time and space to reactivate. And one of the most powerful ways to reconnect with it is precisely through those moments of solitude you fear so much. In the silence without the interference of others' needs, you can start to hear that wise voice that's always been there, the voice that knows when something's not right, that recognizes authenticity and detects manipulation, that knows what nourishes you and what drains you. And when you reconnect with that voice, when you learn to trust it, everything changes. Because you no longer need someone else to confirm your reality. You no longer doubt your perceptions when something feels off. You no longer spend years of your life trying to understand behaviors that simply have no justification. Now, I want to talk about something very important in the process of building healthy relationships: mature communication. This means learning to express your needs without drama, to set boundaries without aggression, to speak your truth without needing the other person to agree. It also means learning to listen without defensiveness, to receive feedback without collapsing, to negotiate differences without losing your center. But to communicate maturely, you first need to know what you want to communicate, and that requires self-awareness, the inner work of reconnecting with your emotions, your needs, your boundaries. Many women tell me, "I don't know how to set boundaries," and I tell them, first you need to know what your boundaries are, because you can't communicate what you don't know. And here's something beautiful: when you know what you want and what you're not willing to tolerate, communication becomes simple, not perfect, not free of conflict, but simple because you speak from clarity, not confusion. Let me talk now about something I see a lot in women learning to relate more healthily: the fear of being too demanding. They've so internalized the idea that being a good woman means having few needs that when they start recognizing and expressing their own, they feel guilty. But let me tell you something: having high standards isn't being demanding, it's being aware of your worth. Knowing you deserve isn't being pretentious, it's being emotionally mature. And anyone who feels threatened by your standards is admitting they can't meet them. That's valuable information about the incompatibility of the relationship. Because, and I want this to be very clear, it's not your job to lower your standards to accommodate someone else's immaturity. Your job is to maintain them and find people who can meet you at that level. Now, I want to talk about something fundamental to mature love: reciprocity. This doesn't mean both people have to give exactly the same thing, but it does mean both are equally committed to the relationship's well-being. In healthy relationships, there's a natural flow of giving and receiving. There isn't one person constantly giving while the other constantly receives. There isn't one person sacrificing while the other benefits. And when you start living from this expectation of reciprocity, your tolerance for one-sided relationships vanishes completely. You can no longer sustain relationships where you're the only one investing, the only one making an effort, the only one prioritizing the other. Let me tell you something that happens when you make this transition to healthier relationships. At first, it might feel strange, almost boring, because you've been used to drama, emotional intensity, the roller coaster of feelings that characterizes toxic relationships. Healthy relationships, by comparison, might seem less passionate, but what's really happening is that you're experiencing something entirely new: emotional stability in the relationship. And emotional stability isn't boredom, it's the foundation on which real intimacy, shared growth, and joint projects can be built. It's the fertile ground where mature love flourishes, because mature love doesn't feed on drama, it feeds on consistency, respect, mutual admiration, and shared growth. It feeds on being able to be yourself without fear of rejection, on showing your vulnerabilities without fear of exploitation. And when you experience this, when you live in a relationship where you can be authentic without negative consequences, you understand why everything before wasn't love. It was dependency, trauma, a repetition of dysfunctional family patterns, but it wasn't love. I want to talk now about something very important in this process: patience with yourself. Unraveling relational patterns you've repeated for decades doesn't happen overnight. You'll have setbacks, you'll doubt yourself, you'll feel nostalgia for relationships you know hurt you. And all of that is normal, it's part of the process. It doesn't mean you're regressing, it means you're being human. The difference lies in how you respond to these moments. Do you use them as an excuse to return to old patterns, or do you use them as information about what you still need to heal? Because here's something I want you to understand. Healing isn't linear. It's not a straight path to emotional perfection. It's an upward spiral where you sometimes revisit old wounds, but each time from a place of greater awareness and resources. And every time you choose not to return to a relationship you know harms you, every time you choose solitude over toxic company, every time you prioritize your emotional well-being, you're strengthening new neural pathways, you're training your brain to choose what's good for you, not what's familiar. Let me tell you about something I see in women who've done this deep work of reconnecting with themselves. They develop what I call the serenity of having chosen themselves. It's a calm that comes from knowing that no matter what happens externally, you'll always have your own company. It's the serenity of someone who no longer fears abandonment because they've learned not to abandon themselves. It's the peace of someone who no longer needs love to come from outside to feel complete. And from that place of personal fullness, the love that arrives is a gift, not a necessity, a complement, not a salvation, a choice, not a compulsion. And when you love from that place, everything changes, because you no longer love from the fear of losing, but from the gratitude of having. You no longer love from scarcity, but from abundance. You no longer love to fill voids, but to share fullness. That's the love you deserve. That's the love you can give when you've found yourself. That's the love that builds relationships that nourish, sustain, and foster growth. And like the dog in our story, sometimes you'll have to walk away from what's familiar to find what you truly need. Sometimes you'll have to leave the farm where you were functional to find the river where you can be free. But when you do, when you have the courage to prioritize yourself, when you find the strength to leave where you're not seen, you'll discover something beautiful. You've always had the keys to your own cage. You just needed the courage to use them.